It's been 2,000 years since the glorious light of the cross illuminated a world veiled in darkness and confusion about the character of God. And still today, the greatest need of mankind is a revelation of God's love as revealed in the life of Christ. Amazing Facts presents the Everlasting Gospel with Pastor Doug Batchelor. Coming to you each week from Sacramento Central Church in sunny California. Discover hidden treasures in God's Word today.
The title of the message this morning is Gay Marriage, a State of Disgrace. Now, those of us here in California can probably quickly figure out what that's dealing with. We are faced with something that is historic in a frightening way. And all the country should be concerned because history has shown us in North America that California is a very progressive state. In some ways it's been very good, in other ways not so good, but it's often true, as goes California, so goes the country. And as the trends go in the U.S., they often then go around the world. So what happens here often has a great influence. And I don't think it's a mistake that we're here in Sacramento Central. I hope we can have a great influence for good and for Christ's kingdom. Just to give you a little background, on May 17th, 2000, 61% of California voters approved something called Proposition 22 that says only marriage between a man and a woman is valid and recognized in California. And I think we all felt a certain amount of temporary security because of that, but it didn't last. In recent months, on May 15th, 2008, the California Supreme Court, 7 individuals. There are 36 million in California. You were right, Stephen. I was wrong. I thought there were fewer. 7 individuals, supposedly representing 36 million, by a 1-judge margin, overturned what the people had voted and said that this prohibition on gay marriage was not constitutional, opening the way for same-sex marriages. They said it violated the state constitution, but the Constitution had always said marriage was between a man and a woman. And they ordered the state to begin processing same-sex marriages as of June 17th, 2008. And that happened. That sent a shudder down my spine because I know my Bible, and I think it's connected. Now, I should probably say at the beginning of this message that I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to bifurcate the things I'm sharing between the biblical perspective. I'm coming to you as a Christian, but I'm also coming to you as an American because I think there's a practical, legal, national perspective, and they are distinct, but there are areas where they overlap. So what we've seen now is both in California and in Massachusetts in the superior courts, a 1-judge margin has redefined what marriage has always been in recorded history for the last 5,000 years. And I think that this is very dangerous. Now, if you look in a dictionary a few months ago and you were to say, what is a definition for marriage? What is marriage? You would find in Webster's, and here I'm quoting from the American Heritage Dictionary, marriage is the legal union of a man and a woman as husband and wife. It is a man and a woman. And this goes in the Bible back to the very beginning. God said it's not good that man should be alone. God originally made man in his own image. And so he created woman for man. And you can read about this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and those two will be one flesh, a man and a woman. That's God's plan. And that can be seen all through nature. Karen, do you mind coming up here? Matter of fact, I don't want to embarrass them, but I'd like to invite Nathan and Stephen up here real quick. And there's a simple illustration, if you don't mind. Okay, what does that mean? They two shall be one flesh. Well, of course, they're to be one, the same way God the Father, Son, and Spirit are one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one in purpose, one in design. But what happens is 2 individuals through a cooperative act of love, become one flesh. Their DNA and genes and all that microscopic stuff commingles and becomes one flesh in the offspring. Now you explain to me how gay marriage can ever be one flesh. It cannot be from the biblical perspective and even from the state perspective. It cannot be one flesh. Thank you very much for that. Now, you know something else while we're on the subject that I never understood is how evolutionists can explain the need for male and female, because it's not very practical when you think about it. They say that in the beginning, that when cells wanted to procreate, that I guess they had a conversation with themselves and said, well, why don't we start a family? And it would split into two cells. And cells just kept growing by splitting, I suppose, like a lot of cells still do today. What in the evolutionary scheme of things would ever necessitate the need for a male and a female to cooperate? It's very inefficient when you think about it. I mean, if you could go back to just splitting to start a family, wouldn't that be simpler? You don't have to, get along or anything with any other cells. But God designed male and female, and you can see it all through creature. Now I realize there are a few exceptions like snails where they're sort of both. But let me tell you, people are not snails. God made us in His own image, and it goes against everything that the Bible says is natural when you endorse gay marriage. And I've got to be sensitive as I talk about this. Pray for me, because I'm a pastor and I know that there are a number of people that struggle with these identity issues. And I think our culture is making it even worse than it would be by trying to normalize something that many people could overcome if they just realize that God will give you the victory and it's wrong. And the gay community would like us to think that there's 10% of the population that has this tendency, but the studies really say it's more like between 1 and 3%. And yet that very vocal militant minority is holding the whole culture captive. The Bible explains that it's a sin. It's inappropriate. Even in our government constitution, there's some language that is used. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, he had that famous preamble. And it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Some things are self-evident. The understanding that marriage is between a man and a woman in every culture, among Buddhists, among Islam, among Jews, among Christian, it is a self-evident truth, and homosexuality is condemned as a perversion and a sin. At least it used to be. A self-evident truth. It can be seen all through nature, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights. That right to happiness is not a right to immorality. Now, pause just for a moment. While our government does protect freedom of religion, and there is an element of separation between the state and the church, meaning that the state does not dictate what your religion is. That springs from, not Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson never issued any legal document talking about that. It springs from Roger Williams, who understood there's a reason that God put the Ten Commandments on two separate tablets. It's not because he was chiseling the Ten Commandments on rock and his letters were too big and he ran out of space on the first stone and said, I guess I better chisel another stone, so there'll be two tablets of stone. No, he could have put it all on one. There's a reason it's on two. The first 4 commandments define our relationship with God, what that God is, who He is, what He looks like, or how we're to worship Him, when to worship Him. That's in the first 4 commandments on the first table of stone. The second table of stone is a distinct table that deals with civil law, our relationships to one another. And every culture understands that you've got to respect the rights of property. You can't steal. You've got to respect the rights of life. You cannot kill. That's under attack now too. And in there, respecting parental authority, that the parents, they're not owned by the community or the village. The parents are responsible for those children. That's in the Ten Commandments. and children must respect their parents. And the sanctity for marriage is in there. You notice it doesn't say that a man should not covet his neighbor's husband. That wasn't even thought of, because that was so reprehensible that it was a self-evident truth that a woman was not supposed to covet her neighbor's wife. That was a self-evident truth. But we've fallen a long way. The Bible talks about it as something that is unnatural. Romans chapter 1, verse 26. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use of what is for that which is against nature. I got to pause right here, and I realize that we have children here. But unfortunately, things have gotten so decadent in our society that there's very little chance they have not already been exposed to this. And if I don't say anything, they're going to see it all around them pretty soon, because it'll be sanctified by the government. So I don't know any graceful way to do this without just doing it straight on. By the way, it is in the Bible. They exchange the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also men, leaving the natural use, the self-evident natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one for another, men with men, committing that which is shameful, receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And yet, if I don't say something now, we will soon have the same problem. I can't air this program in Canada. Did you know that? And by the way, I hope that this program, what I'm sharing with you now, I hope that you copy it. I hope you get it from the Amazing Facts website and the Central Church website, and I hope you email it to all your friends, not only in California, but especially in California, but all over the country, because we got a problem. We've been intimidated by a minority of perverted people who are wanting us to sanctify and vindicate what they know is wrong, and they're trying to use us to do it. The Bible says, committing that which is shameful. It's disgraceful. We are living in California, which is the state of disgrace right now, that we are justifying same-sex marriage. And I'm trying to be sensitive, because we love people. Can God save homosexuality? Yeah, you just read there in the memory verse. So homosexuals will not enter the kingdom of heaven. But he goes on to say, and such were some of you. They can get the victory over those tendencies. People are tempted with all kinds of temptations, both mental and physical temptations. The devil will throw all kinds of things at it, but at least start with, you can't be healed until you realize this is wrong, and God needs to save me from it. But the problem is, and I'm reading about this right now, Romans chapter 1, God gave them up to their vile passions because they refused to recognize it was vile. He withdrew his spirit. Men committing what is shameful, receiving in themselves the penalty for their error, which was due. Leviticus 20, if you want to know how the Lord feels, if a man lies with a man as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. That word abomination means cause for abhorrence and disgust. It means a stench in the nose of God. They shall be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. God had some pretty strong feelings about this, and yet I get letters, because I talk about this periodically. It's been around for years. I get letters from people in the gay community who say, well, Pastor Doug, you're misinterpreting these scriptures. I'm sorry, friends. If that isn't plain, then nothing in the Bible is plain. But you wouldn't believe, when a person's blinded by lust and by what they want, they can talk themselves, they can rationalize just about anything. It's a sin. It's wrong. God says it's an abomination. It's unnatural. Even the most primitive, uneducated people in the world know that men and women go together, men and men don't. Now, just for clarity, there's nothing wrong with a man loving a man. David loved Jonathan, and Jonathan loved David, and I love our fellow church members, but you got to be careful in California right now for me to say I love a man, because people misunderstand that. But I've got some friends and I love them. You know what I mean? I got a group of guys I go camping with, and I love every one of them, but not the way they're starting to love them in California. That's not right. The Bible calls that a perversion. And it's okay for a lady to have girlfriends, but not like they're wanting to talk about girlfriends now. So it's okay that we love each other. But we're not talking about love. These new laws have nothing to do with love. But all the advertising you're going to see, there's going to be a war in the media pretty soon over these propositions. They're going to make it sound like we're trying to outlaw love. Has nothing to do with love. It has to do with lust. It has to do with perversion that they're wanting to vindicate. Because in their consciences they know it's not right. Let's talk about the government. What did our founding fathers believe about these things? You can go back, for instance, to William Blackstone was the judge who wrote his commentaries on law, the English law. It's the basis for legal jurisprudence in all of America. It was widely accepted by the founding fathers. Listen to what he says in his commentary. He doesn't even know how to talk about it. It was so abhorrent and embarrassing for him. But when he gets to the subject of addressing homosexuality, he found it reprehensible. He was ashamed to discuss it. Nevertheless, he noted, what has here been observed, the fact that the punishment fit the crime ought to be the more clear in proportion as the crime is the more detestable and may be applied to another offense of still deeper malignity. The infamous crime against nature committed either with man or beast. Oh, by the way, in the Bible, when it talks about this, it talks about homosexuality and bestiality in the same passage. They're back to back. That's next. People are going to be wanting to get married to their dogs and cats. California. Well, really, you think about where this might go. The same arguments that are being used for same-sex marriage, what's to prevent two twin brothers from going and asking for a license? Obviously, you don't need to worry about the offspring. I mean, normally you wouldn't want to marry your sister because there could be some genetic problems, right? But two twin brothers, they don't have that risk. What's to prevent them from getting married? Or triplets. You see what I'm saying? The same, I mean, if we all love each other, why can't the state recognize it? Do you have any idea where this will go? If you don't draw the line somewhere and put your foot down somewhere and stop being intimidated by a perverted culture, then it's your own fault. And quite frankly, I'm shocked I'm not hearing more outrage among Americans, Californians, and especially Christians. It's something happening all around us. It's because, well, I'll get to that later. Anyway, so he goes on, a crime which ought to be strictly and impartially proved and then strictly and impartially punished. This was the foundational law for America. I will not act so disagreeable a part to my readers, he's going on in his commentary, as well as to myself to dwell any longer upon that subject, the very mention of which is a disgrace to human nature. He called it a crime not fit to be named. That's how our founding fathers felt about it. General George Washington, he's one of the first ones that had to deal with the possibility of this in the military. It was outlawed and punished, and they were discharged with infamy. The first 13 states, once they became more established, they had laws punishing this by everything from imprisonment, sometimes 10 years hard labor, some states hanging, death. If you're wanting to know how our founding fathers interpreted that Constitution, it had nothing to do with starting to say that anybody could get married, two men together, two women together, triplets. It's considered morally abhorrent, reprehensible, and something that right now I'm afraid we're becoming shameless. America has been anesthetized by the media. What would normally be reprehensible to us, shameful, an abomination, because we have been bombarded with subliminal messages, a blizzard of programs that come over the TV. All the popular sitcoms, they've got their gay characters and they're so winsome and funny, and you get the decorators and they're all flaunting their gayness, and these cooks on TV and they're all flaunting it, and it's just they kid each other about it and they joke about it, and little by little our sensibilities about what is appropriate and what is normal, we've been anesthetized against something that's going to cut our heart out as a nation. So the people, it's happening all, it's like boiling a frog. Little by little, they're turning up the heat so that people aren't saying anything. You know, before an enemy comes in, like when we first entered Iraq, and I'm not going to go to that subject, I'm just telling you that it's a battle tactic, whether it was D-Day. They send in the bombers first, and they soften up the resistance through bombardment. And through the constant bombardment, the enemy, they can't touch or see, it's just coming over the airwaves. We have been softened up for this invasion, so that when it finally happens, we're numb. We think, well, is it wrong? And we've lost our conscience of what is right and wrong. Conscience has been anesthetized by all of this. Little by little, churches have been caving in. Martin Luther would turn over in his grave if he knew that the Lutherans were now saying that, this may not be wrong. Episcopals, United Church of Christ, ordaining gay ministers. And in the light, don't just call, please, if you're going to do that, don't call yourself a Bible church. Because the teachings of the Bible on this subject are as clear as the teachings on any other subject. 1 Timothy 4, verse 2. Person's conscience can get where they don't understand anymore. Speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. Can a person get to the place where their conscience is numb and they don't realize when something's wrong? John chapter 3, verse 19. Here Jesus describes what the problem is. This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light. Why? Because their deeds were evil. When a person is living a perverted lifestyle and they don't want to change and repent and turn from that lifestyle, they can get to the place where they don't comprehend the light. They're living in darkness because their deeds are evil and they don't want the light. These are the words of Jesus. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds might be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. And so this message this morning is for everybody, especially those who might be struggling with these tendencies. Take that first step and recognize this is what the Word says, and pray and say, Lord, your Word says this is wrong, and I've got this struggle, I've got this problem, and I need victory, and He can give you victory. He can change you. One reason that I believe there has been a rise of this behavior in our culture is because of the corresponding breakdown of the families. Now, there have been plenty of studies done, and the homosexual community would like us to believe that this is something genetic, that you're born with. And virtually all of the studies that have been done where they try to prove that have been done by homosexual physicians, homosexual scientists that are trying to justify and vindicate their behavior, and it has been, these studies have been proven to be so bogus and slanted. They took a bunch of brain scans of homosexuals and said there's part of their brain that's different. Well, they failed to mention that the corpses they took the brain scans on of those who were homosexuals also died of HIV, and it could be possible. That's why their brains were different. But they don't want to mention that in the studies. So it's very corrupted science. The real evidence suggests that it's environmental, meaning there is a very critical time in the development of a child where when they're growing up, that something clicks within. I'm a boy, I'm a girl. And that identification, that recognition happens, and they bond. And it's important to have the mother and the father for the boys and the girls growing up around at that time so they can get the right bonding. I think I've told you before that Karen and I went on this camping trip one time, kayaking down a river. And we went walking by ourselves, and we came upon a little pool of water there by the river, and there was this baby newborn duck just hatched by himself. I don't know what happened. I don't know if the mother flew off or the egg got misplaced. I don't know what happened. This little thing was just peeping around, and I thought, this is the cutest little duck. There's no mama duck, no nest around. Very young. So I didn't take much. I ran. I caught it. This beep, 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 beep. And at first it was terrified. We took it back to camp to show everybody, and they said, well, you ought to let it go. Just put it down in the river, and it looked around. It went beep, 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 and it climbed back up to where we were. And it stayed with us. Camped with us that night. Next day we had to kayak down the river, and we said, well, poor little thing. I mean, we're going to be going down some rapids, and we didn't know what to do. But it slept in our sleeping bags, followed us around. So we get in the river in our kayaks, and we take off. We wave goodbye to the little duck. We felt so bad, and the thing jumps in the water and comes after us. But you know what, friends? It's a sad story. it wasn't too long before that duck found out it wasn't a kayak. And there might be a lot of young people that during that critical time in their life, there's some confusion about the identity. And I'm sure there's a combination of factors. But ultimately, God gives us a free will, and we can choose what we do. We can choose not to live by our passions and desires, but to live by faith. We must not be controlled by the flesh, but we must be controlled by the Spirit and the Word of God. So whatever your desires are, I mean, we've already seen what happens with a culture where you just eat whatever feels good. I mean, it'll destroy you, right? You can't just live by your flesh and your desires and your passions. So back to our study here. People's consciences have been largely anesthetized. I just heard, was it last week on the radio, they had the talk radio discussing the famous Hallmark greeting card company is now issuing cards for same-sex marriages. And they said, well, you know, there's a market out there, and we just are here to serve the populace, and probably others will follow suit pretty soon. Two men in tuxedos on top of a cake, and two women on top of a cake, and they got a bunch of them that says, two hearts, one promise. Jesus said, John 12:40, speaking of the people in this age, He has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they should see with their eyes, and lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, and I should heal them. People refusing to see. Now, marriage is a moral institution. Why gays who are doing something the Bible calls an abomination, a perversion, revolting, shameful, unnatural, why they would want it to be sanctified? The word sanctified means being made holy. Who can make something holy but God? Does the state make anything holy? So it's really an oxymoron, gay marriage. There is no such thing. How can you call something holy that the Bible condemns as unholy? How can you look for God to bless something that His Word says is cursed? It's called holy matrimony. And to me, it just seems so bizarre that people would come before a minister, two guys or two ladies, and stand there and have him open the Bible and bless their relationship. Doesn't that seem a little incongruous to you? And you know why the state even gets involved in marriage? Because there's children. Otherwise, if there were never any children in a marriage, if people don't get along, we'll say goodbye, right? But the state gets involved because there's the care of the children that are vulnerable. They can't take care of themselves. So why do you need the state to endorse gay marriage? The only way they have children is by proxy. They borrow them, basically, or they have them with somebody else and they bring them in, or they try to adopt them to vindicate their marriage. And the Lord have mercy on those kids that are being used like that, and the models that they have before them. I'm telling you, friends, based on what I read in the Bible, and if you've got problems with what I'm saying, please skip over me and go to Jesus. Take it up with Him. This is the teaching of Christ in His Word. It's like Paul says, am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? The Bible tells us that ministers need to be watchmen on the walls, and if I don't lift up the trumpet and give it a certain sound at a time like this, then I've got your blood on my hands. So I can't be quiet when our state, I'm a Californian, I was born here, making a law to do something that we never did in our history and to vindicate something that our fathers believed was a perversion. It's a moral institution. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, on through verse 4, Paul warned us what would happen in the last days. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure more than, or rather than lovers of God. You cannot live for pleasure and claim to be a lover of God. You know, when they interview people who are clamoring for the rights to marry, gay marriage, it is kind of bizarre because the research seems to indicate that homosexual men often have up to 3,000 or 4,000 different partners. So that doesn't seem like that it's just the relationship that a person is interested in. And the statistics are not quite as high for the women. They're a little more relationship oriented. Many of those partners among the men are 16 and under when they take these anonymous surveys. And it just can't be good for the culture. What's really going on now is there's a war. There's a war that's taking place in our culture for what's decent and right. And we're being bombarded. And in many ways, it's a war of words and terms. An example, there's a proposition now on the ballot in November. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, ministers in churches, 501c3, we're not allowed by the law to endorse candidates. We are allowed to address issues. What I'm talking about is something that should be of interest to, doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, what you are. This is an issue. And we are allowed to talk about this in the church. There's a proposition that is coming, and by the way, and I hope you go to Alan Reinach's presentation next Sabbath in the afternoon. He's going to be talking about the same subject from more of the legal side. He's got that background and experience. But this is just a very, very serious issue, friends. I started saying something, and then I distracted. Oh, it's a war of terms. So there's a proposition on the ballot. It's called Proposition 8, and it says that marriage should just be between a man and a woman. It's very simple language. But when it was presented to the state, it was presented as to protect marriage, a proposition to protect marriage. Well, some people in San Francisco legally twisted it and said, no, we're not going to let you refer to it that way. It's against gay marriage. It's not for, it's against gay marriages, is the way that we insist that you market this. I mean, even the very word gay. Who invented that? Not heterosexuals. It was invented by gay people to just make it look like, well, we're just a little happier than everyone else. But the fact is, that's not true. And in the language and the terms that are being used, it's a counterfeit for marriage. They're running commercials now. And it shows somebody running to the altar. It shows a lady running to the altar trying to get married. And everyone keeps stopping the person from getting married. And then it goes on to say, how would you feel if people tried to stop you from marrying the one you love? And so they're trying to frame this in the context of, if you vote for Proposition 8, you're against love. That has nothing to do with it. You're against perversion is what it has to do. And you're for marriage. You're for what the Bible says marriage is. You're for what our founding fathers and our country has always believed marriage is. But they're using creative. I'll tell you what, friends. Now, I know something about what I'm talking about. I grew up with a mother in show business in New York City, Beverly Hills. I didn't grow up in a vacuum. I did not grow up a Christian. A lot of the composers and the actors and the writers and choreographers that my mother worked with growing up were all openly gay. And I remember having some of them say to me, Doug, it is a conflict of terms when we say we're gay, because we are the most unhappy people in the world. It's not a happy life. For a person to try to a duck to pretend they're a kayak, you're never going to be satisfied. It just isn't going to work. Very creative. Very talented. And the advertising campaign, boy, they're going to have some of the brightest minds in the world working to defeat this proposition. You can count on that. That's why you're going to have to use self-evident common sense. So it's a war of terms. It's being framed as against marriage. You know, who was it? Abraham Lincoln. He would sometimes get into the political arena, and he was amazed at how people would twist common sense. And he loved to ask folks. He'd say, how many legs does a dog have? And they'd say, well, 4 legs. And Lincoln would say, well, let's suppose that you call the tail a leg. Then how many legs does a dog have? And they'd say, well, then 5. He said, wrong. Just because you call the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. And that's what's happening. It doesn't matter what you call it. We all know what it is. And so it's a war of words. They're trying to change the terms. Listen to what Jesus said. Luke 16, verse 15. You are those who justify yourselves before men. This is a whole movement from a very small minority that is very vocal and outspoken. And they've basically got control of the media, in case you didn't know that. All kinds of punishment and reprisals if you should have the audacity to speak out in the media against gay. It goes a lot further than a pie in the face that Jerry Falwell got. I don't know if I have time. Matter of fact, I want to recommend a book right here in the middle of this message. Gary Gibbs wrote a book that Amazing Facts carries. I think we could probably offer to send it to anybody that is watching the program or listening. It's called Return to Sodom. Talks about a very militant, organized gay agenda in North America, and we recommend that. But it's going to be an organized war, friends, and if we don't stand for something now, we're going to fall for anything, and it will be our own fault. Now's the time to speak up. It's going to cost us. It's going to cost the culture. It's going to cost financially. For one thing, you know what's going to happen soon is we're going to be where Canada is, where you won't be even allowed to say there's something wrong with being gay up front. It'll be called a hate crime on the level of you're ranting against a certain race or a certain religion. And pretty soon we're going to get to the place where you can't even say you disagree with another religion. It'll be called a hate crime. And you're going to have the ACLU and all kinds of other people suing. Heard about two ladies, heterosexual ladies, that had a little more room in their apartment. They put it on an ad and said, we're looking for another woman that would like to rent some space and she will share the expenses. A lesbian applied and they said, no, we're not comfortable with that. She then sued them. She won. They were fined. They had to go to sensitivity counseling classes that were taught by lesbians and check in with the community every 3 years. Or for 3 years every year. Just because they didn't even have the right. It was called discrimination. I'll tell you, it's not getting better, friends, if we don't speak up now. Pastors are going to be sued. Couples are going to come and say, we're gay, we want to get married. And they're going to say, I don't want to do those marriages. Already there have been justices of the peace in California that have lost their jobs because they said, look, I'm not going to perform. They work for the state, and the state said, it's the law. You're out of here. And they've lost their jobs after years of faithful service because they said, I cannot conscientiously marry two people of the same sex. So they lost their jobs. And they'll be suing churches next. I'm telling you, friends, we need to send a very clear and decisive message to those folks that some things just don't go, that they're not right. It's also going to cost money. There's going to be all kinds of very strange litigation in these divorces. And you know, they'll be getting the same tax benefit as families. So they're really masquerading as families, though they're not. It's just two people of the same sex that are cohabiting together and practicing a perverted life that want the vindication of being a family, of calling it marriage, of being endorsed by our society. That's the wrong direction, friends. And we need to take a stand. I think it's bad for traditional families. Studies have shown that the optimal environment for raising children, and I realize there's some single parent families, but I think especially those families will realize and agree. I grew up with my mom, my brother and I in a single parent family. Back and forth between dad and mom. It wasn't ideal, friends. I'll tell you right now, the ideal is to have a mother and a father. It's not daddy and his boyfriend or mommy and her girlfriend. Is not the optimal sociological environment for children. Soon, if this law does not get overturned, and we have a chance to overturn it, we'll be forced in school to recognize this. Children will be taught that this is a normal behavior in the public schools. They'll be required to. As a matter of fact, in health education classes, state law requires teachers to instruct children as young as kindergarten about marriage. Education Code 51890, if the gay marriage ruling is not overturned, teachers will be required to teach young children there is no difference between gay marriage and traditional marriage. And I don't think that's going to be good for us as a country, as a state. You know, these are signs of the end. This is what Jesus said would happen. If you just look in your Bibles, friend, Luke chapter 17, verse 26 through verse 30, Jesus is speaking, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate and they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. Then flood came and destroyed them all. Now I want to pause right here. I read something a little while ago that kind of surprised me. Jeffrey Stanover, who holds an MD from Princeton, doctorates from Yale, MIT, and Harvard. This is a smart guy. He said there's only one other time in history of the world that it has happened where a government sanctioned marriage between men and men or women and women. And, you know, your first reaction would be Sodom. No, it's not Sodom. You might think it must have been ancient Greece, and that was a problem in ancient Greece, and that's part of why they fell. We're not talking about Greece. It wasn't Rome. Rome had a problem. Edward Gibbons, in his Fall of the Roman Empire, he itemized that one of the problems was the men lost their masculinity, and they became effeminate. You know when it was? According to the Babylonian Talmud, this is the scriptures, a group of writings that the Jews used for interpreting the scriptures 1,000 years before Christ. It says there was only one other time in history that reflects where we are right now. According to these writings, it's the only other time when the government sanctioned homosexual marriage. It wasn't Sodom and Gomorrah. It wasn't Babylon. It was the days of Noah. According to them, the straw that broke the camel's back before the flood was when they began to issue same-sex contracts between men and men in marriage before the flood, and then the flood came. That's also confirmed by Rabbi Ira Sepro. He verified this saying to be true. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, they did not write marriage contracts between men. There was homosexuality, and it was wrong, but it was never officially blessed policy. And now we are living in the days of Noah. Jesus went on. I didn't finish. He said, likewise as it was in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built, but on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. He says conditions are going to mirror the conditions of Sodom. And by the way, Lot referred to what those men wanted to do with the angels. He said, do not this great wickedness. It's wicked.